Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Today, we are going to continue our fourth conversation with Nish on spiral dynamics. And today we have two new participants, Maureen Tobin. She's an expert in coaching and business management. She's also a long-term practitioner of Tibetan Buddhism. Today we also have Cindy Wigglesworth. She's an expert in spiritual intelligence, and she has been a spiritual consultant for Fortune 500 companies, and she has appeared on Oprah. Nish, it seems like you wanted to give a context on our conversation today before we start discussing on waking up and growing up phases.
Yes, please. Thank you. So today what we're proposing to talk about are the contrasts between what in integral theory is referred to as growing up and waking up, two types of development, two different sequences of stages or states that human beings can develop through and experience. So I wanted to start by just giving a little bit of context as to one way to understand these two types of development and how they might contrast with one another. So I'd like to start briefly by just looking at and reminding ourselves of the two, what are referred to as the two halves of the brain, the left brain and the right brain, and the functions these halves of the brain have been discovered to primarily be involved with. So the left brain tends to be associated with logical, rational thinking. It's the purpose of the left brain, or the function of the left brain, to explain and interpret what we perceive of reality. And we've also found, neuroscientists have also found that it's primarily in the left brain that we create a narrative of a discrete and separate self that we could call the ego, which then moves around and functions in the world and seeks to protect itself, survive, perpetuate. The right brain, on the other hand, has been found to be more associated with what we could call intuition. A couple of ways we could understand what this might mean. Intuition could be understood as being some kind of immediate apprehension of reality without having to go through reasoning and discursive processes. And intuition could be also said to give us a direct knowledge of reality or some aspect of reality without us having to engage in rational thinking or in a process of deduction or induction or inference. So my suggestion, and we touched on this briefly at the end of the last talk, is that the left brain and the right brain, we can see a dominance of these two halves of the brain in what we could refer to as the classical Western approach to life, by which I really mean the approach that was started in ancient Greece with thinkers like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, but really that flowered in Western Europe since the time of what we call the Renaissance. And that can be contrasted with a classical Eastern approach to life, by which I'm really referring to the Eastern mystical traditions such as Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, to some extent Jainism, Sikhism. And my contention here is that the Western approach, the classical Western approach, has tended to be left brain dominant, whereas the classical Eastern approach has tended to be right brain dominant. That's a generalization, obviously, but roughly speaking, I think we can talk in those terms. So I'll just quickly summarize what I mean by the classical Western and Eastern approaches. So the classical Western approach, I think, tends to see life as an opportunity for fulfillment, for perfection, and the fulfillment and perfection of whom? Of the separate self, of the separate ego that has been created, the narrative of which has been created by the left brain. Western approach has tended to be based on body-based experience. And because of that, I think it has developed, it's no surprise that science, what we call science, or the quest for scientific knowledge based on empirical evidence that is based on the senses, which are of the body, has tended to arise in the West. And as a result of this left brain dominance, the greater emphasis and belief in this distinct separate self, there has been an emphasis in the Western world on individual freedom, individual rights, democracy, and also there has tended to be an approach that human beings can control nature for our own benefit. Some of the more familiar things in the East, such as devotion to the guru, mystical experience, submission to the divine, whilst these certainly have existed in their own form in some of the Middle Eastern traditions that have been more dominant in the West, in this classical Western approach that I'm talking about, these aspects of life have tended to be suppressed. They don't really fit in and are actually, if anything, a threat to this left brain ego separate self that's been created by the left brain narrative. We can contrast this with the Eastern approach to life, which I think has tended to be more based on an immediate apprehension without reasoning, which I think gives rise to what we can very generally refer to as mystical experience. So here, life, instead of being this amazing opportunity for fulfillment and perfection, tends to be seen ultimately as suffering or as illusion. And the purpose of life has tended to be seen in the Eastern traditions as freedom from this cycle of birth and death. There's a belief in reincarnation, and the purpose of life here is seen as freedom from this process whereby the ego, the separate self, is recycled again and again and again, just to suffer again and again. And instead, the purpose is to get out of this into some state which we could call moksha or nirvana, where we go beyond the ego completely. Now, the methods that the Eastern approach has tended to use to bring about this realization include devotion, mystical experience, submission to the divine. And the approach has tended to be that through this mystical experience, which is intuitive in nature rather than rational in nature, we get access to some kind of higher knowledge, which reveals to us the real, true meaning and purpose of existence. And again, this is seen directly, without reasoning, without inferring. And in contrast to the Western approach, the Eastern approach has tended to suppress or give very little importance to the kind of worldly pursuits that have become dominant in the West. Obviously, the East is significantly Westernizing now in recent decades, but I'm talking about the more classical Eastern approach that we see in the traditions. So left brain, growing up, right brain, waking up. Left brain, Western, right brain, Eastern. Now, my suggestion is that in both of these approaches to life, we can see two types of development taking place, which exist and proceed relatively independent of one another until perhaps we reach some very high stages when they perhaps start to merge. So the left brain Western approach we're calling growing up, and that we can think of as a process of psychological maturity of this finite self. The finite self, the ego that's been constructed by the left brain and which explains and interprets reality, goes through a process of becoming progressively more and more mature, and therefore explaining and interpreting reality in progressively more mature ways. And we'll come to see what exactly mature means in that context. So the classical Western path really is the fulfillment and perfection of this finite self through growing up in the manifest world. In contrast to that, the classical Eastern approach has been what we could call waking up, and that we can see another series of stages, and again, we'll elaborate on this later, whereby we see stages of progressive spiritual awakening, where we get a deeper and more comprehensive, direct apprehension of reality without reasoning and inferring. And what we discover that way, according to these traditions, we discover an underlying unity behind creation, an underlying harmony, an interconnectedness between things, and we discover our real self, which is not this constructed ego, but is what can be referred to as the true self, which some traditions will describe as pure awareness, pure consciousness, in Buddhism, it's referred to as no self or nirvana. So that's the classical Eastern path, freedom from suffering of the small self and the ego, and the discovery of this true self, or which gives us access to higher knowledge. So that's the context I'm laying out. So I'll hand that back to Suma.
Thank you for that context. And today, our conversation is going to be split in two main parts, the growing up phase and waking up phase. So if you could start with the growing up phase, Nish, and we kind of like made like 3 topics to focus on today: health and illness, chakra system, and understanding enlightenment from the perspective of growing up and how spiral dynamics applies to it. So if we can first start with health and illness and how spiral dynamics applies to this, that would be great.
Sure, thank you. So what I'll do is I'll bring up some slides. So I'll just check if you can all see that. Yep, great. Now, I'm sure most of you are very familiar with spiral dynamics, but in case any of you aren't, and for people watching, I'll just spend 5 minutes just recapping on what spiral dynamics is, and then we can really fill that out by looking at these 3 examples in more detail that Suma has just mentioned. So spiral dynamics is one way of modeling and explaining this growing up process. So it's a model of the evolutionary development which applies to individuals, to organizations, to societies. It was developed by 3 prominent individuals here who contributed to the development of this model: Claire Graves, Don Edward Beck, Christopher Cowan. And what spiral dynamics aims to do is to look at and explain how we grow up through looking at the life conditions and the mind's capabilities, and how the life conditions and the mind's capabilities interact to bring about the emergence of new value systems and new worldviews. Each new level of development of this growing up process is a response to solving the problems that we saw that emerged when the previous level of development reached its sort of peak or zenith. And as each new value system emerges, what we find are that groups and cultures restructure their societies and individuals integrate within those new social structures. And numerous cross-cultural studies have shown that these value systems always develop in this very specific order, which we'll be now quickly going through and outlining. So, a very quick overview of the stages of spiral dynamics, and I apologize that I'll have to do this very quickly, but I'm sure most of you know this extremely well. So the altitudes of development that spiral dynamics talks about will start at the beginning, at the earliest stage, and work our ways through these quickly. So the earliest stage of development that spiral dynamics identifies is the archaic level, which in spiral dynamics language we can refer to as beige. And this really is the dawning of self-awareness. It came online about 250,000 years ago. It's when self-awareness started to dawn in a very tiny way. And at this stage, human beings were surviving mainly through instinct, through intuition, through banding with others. No real significant sense of a separate self here. Now, what tends to happen is there are factors that cause or bring about transitions between these levels. So I think as human beings developed, an intuition arose that its survival is going to become much easier in groups rather than trying to survive independently. And a need arose, I think, for the sense of belonging. That need for belonging started to arise in consciousness. And we then saw the emergence of the next level, which spiral dynamics refers to as purple. Purple is the level that we could, in very general terms, refer to as the level of tribal belonging, the level of magic. Here, consciousness sees the world as enchanted. It's a magical place. We're now starting to differentiate ourselves from the world in a way we hadn't at age. And as we start to differentiate ourselves, the world with which we're still embedded to some degree starts to look somewhat enchanted and magical. At this level, we value ritual, we value deep community, the tribe, and here the individual tends to be subordinate to the group. This came online around 50,000 years ago. Now, in the next level, the red level, what we see now is an emerging identity of a separate ego. And this is the first level where we can really start to talk in real significant terms of the arisal of the sense of a strong separate self. This is the egocentric level. Here, the ego, which now has emerged, narrative of the left brain, is now seeing itself as separate from the world, separate from the tribe, and therefore has to be constantly vigilant about its own separate survival. This leads to an attitude which tends to be aggressive. Life is a jungle. We have to survive. That requires aggression much of the time. We still haven't really developed conceptual thinking in any significant way, symbolic thinking certainly, but not full-blown concepts. So here, consciousness tends to be impulsive, ruthless, and the positive side, courageous, determined, powerful. This is where we see the arisal of the myth of the hero. And this came online around 15,000 years ago. The next stage, I think, largely developed in response to the need to start to bring some kind of order to the more chaotic conditions that were arising from red. And also, I think the ego at red, it is at this level that we started to develop a fear of death, because a fear of death is unavoidable when we think of ourselves as a separate self that could die. And I think this gave rise to the arisal of the next level, the traditional level, the level which spiral dynamics refers to as blue. This is typically the level where we see the arisal of traditional religions, which can bring control to the chaos of red. And it can also give beliefs that can help to overcome or at least subdue the fear of death that has arisen at red. So blue tends to be ethnocentric, nation-centric. So we're seeing a widening of our sense of identity. Purple, the identity was very much with the tribe. Now it's with the nation. It's a widening from a much smaller ethnocentric to a bigger ethnocentric. Here at blue, we value rules, roles, discipline. We have a faith in a transcendent God, transcendent order. This level tends to be socially conservative. We need to keep people well ordered. This came online around 5,000 years ago and really reached a real peak around about what historians refer to as the axial age. Now, the next level to come online here is what we could call the orange level, the modern orange level. Now, we saw some early pioneers of orange in ancient Greece, the people I mentioned earlier, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, but it really came online in a significant way in the Western world around 300 to 500 years ago. Orange here values rationality and science. It values individualism and democracy. And as a consequence of that, the way of organizing society tends to be capitalist, and the way of understanding reality tends to be materialist. Here, once again, we now, in the same way that we saw red doing to purple, orange does to blue, we develop an individuality that takes us somewhat independent to some degree from that ethnocentric attitude and identification that we saw at blue. So here at orange, the individual is now willing to engage in risk-taking, self-reliance. Much of the modern world is still, at the moment, has a center of gravity at orange. The next level to come online here is the postmodern level, what we could call the green level. Here, we start to go beyond this absolute trust in science and reason, and we start to value pluralism and equality. It's not just our own culture now that we identify with, but we now value all cultures. And in its strongest form, green would regard all cultures, all views, all ways of looking at things as being equal. There's a sort of certain relativism comes online here. So this level is relativistic and it's sensitive to your feelings, sensitive to other people's feelings. Some of the major manifestations we see here at green include civil rights, which is very much about equality, environmentalism, which is also very much about treating nature as our equal rather than something we can just use for our own benefits, which was very strong at orange. And this level, because of its pluralism, is very world-centric. We now think of ourselves more as citizens of the world than citizens of a particular country. So we're moving to a world-centric orientation here. And this level tended to come online around 50 years ago. The 1960s typically as a time people point to as when green started to emerge in a major way. The hippie movement is an example of green at its best. The next level after green to come online in this model is perhaps the level that actually created this model of spiral dynamics, which is the integral level we can refer to, and that is what spiral dynamics would refer to as yellow. Now here we start to see that we still have the pluralism of green, but now we start to see that there are natural hierarchies and systems of systems within these pluralistic worldviews that we simply saw in a more flat way at green. So whereas green would look at every worldview and say, well, they're all equal, there's no way of judging, yellow would start to look at these and see a natural hierarchy of development in the way that views evolve, and a greater understanding of the world in terms of systems and systems of systems. Yellow can hold multiple perspectives together at the same time. It tends to be flexible, creative, and actually very effective in navigating the world, simply because it can hold all of these multiple perspectives and tends to develop a certain wisdom about which perspective is valid in which context. A very simple way to think of this is that green perceived real diversity for the first time, but didn't have a very clear way of bringing about intelligent discrimination between that diversity. Yellow can see diversity, but can also bring in intelligent discrimination in the good sense of the term, amongst that diversity.
Nish,
yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Would you mind pressing play on the slideshow so that we can see a bigger
Sure.
picture? Would be right.
Of course, yes.
Thank
Sorry.
you. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Thank you.
Is that better? And the last level that I'll be talking about today, we won't talk about post-integral today. The last level I'll be mentioning today is what we can refer to as turquoise. Now, turquoise tends to start to see the world. We're starting to move into what we could tentatively call spiritual territory here now. So turquoise tends to see the world almost as an organism. The world is alive, it's evolving. We tend to move now to a holistic way of looking at things and a cosmocentric way. We're not even just world-centric anymore. We now start to think of ourselves as even more than belonging to just this world. It's cosmocentric. And we are able now to live both from the point of view of an individual self and perhaps also from the point of view of this emerging transpersonal self that starts to emerge here. We're looking at in more detail at that later. But what we start to see here, what starts to emerge here is a sense of a big self that goes beyond the person. And here in mature turquoise, we perhaps get this ability to live from both this separate individual self and this bigger transpersonal self. And we can speculate that, or there seems to be some evidence that this is the current cutting edge of development for which we have any real evidence. That's starting to emerge now. Okay, so what I'm going to do now, having given that quick reminder, is Suma mentioned these three applications of spiral dynamics that we're going to look at briefly, and then we'll open this up for discussion. Now, the reason to do this is to fill out some of the details of what or how this development might work, not just in this abstract form, but by looking at specific examples. So the first example that we're going to look at is health and illness. How does our attitude or understanding and way we deal with the phenomenon of health and illness change or evolve as we move through these levels, as we develop through these levels? I just want to check you can see this new slide, health and illness. Okay. Yep, great. Thank you. Okay, so I'll go through these. Health and illness. Beige. Now, I think at beige, we don't really have a concept of illness. Obviously, we fall ill, but what we would call ill. But at this level, we haven't developed any real conceptual thinking. We're living by instinct, and we're instinctually just trying to survive. We're not even thinking or conceiving of anything that we would call health and illness. It's just this instinctual search for survival. Purple. Now, this is where we move into this magical tribal level of development and this magical tribal way of looking at things. So one way we could see an attitude to health and illness emerging here is what we can call the shamanic view. Now, in the shamanic view, illness tends to be seen or can be seen as primarily a spiritual problem rather than merely a physical problem. So the kinds of diagnoses that could be given for illness here at purple would be things like curses. Someone's cursed you, someone's put an evil eye on you. Demon possession, soul loss, astrology, that your planets aren't right at the moment. You're in a Saturn period, and because of that, you've fallen ill. So here, illness is seen very much as something non-material, magically affecting you in some way. And the cure to these magical problems is through magical spiritual means. So examples of these would be exorcism, let's cast out the demon. Shamanic healing, let's heal the curses. Let's do some soul retrieval and heal the soul loss. Let's do some fire rituals and appease the planets. So this would be one way that purple might understand and deal with illness. Now, red. Red is the level at which the ego first starts to emerge. And in mature red, what we see here is the development of what we could refer to as the hero, the hero's quest. Now, red might see health and illness because red is all about power, strength. Red might see health and illness as a manifestation of weakness. Health and illness just isn't something strong, heroic people do. It's a sign of weakness. You're weak if you're ill. It could also be seen as a badge of honor, as scars of war. Your illness, your injuries, these are symptoms of the trials and tribulations that you've had to go through and you've overcome. The hero comes back from war with wounds that are commendable. They show what a hero has been. And one of the ways red might deal with illness or injury to the extent that it would want to heal or cure these problems would be to call on its power gods. So the red level tends to believe through projection in these egotistical gods. The general principle here being that we see the spiritual realm largely as a projection of how we see ourselves. If we see ourselves as heroes, if we are experiencing life through the ego level of development, if power is what we're seeking, then we tend to see the gods in those terms. So at red, we call on the power gods to help us to heal, to conquer. Examples of these in Hinduism are, again, Vedic rituals. And if you study the mythology of the gods at this level, they tend to be very egoistic gods. They're going around doing egoistic things. They're jealous gods, they're vengeful gods. It's a manifestation of what we are, a projection of what we are. Blue. Now, blue is the level where we see the dominance of traditional religion much of the time. So what is health and illness here? Well, illness here can be seen as a punishment for sin. You've been disobedient. You haven't obeyed the 10 commandments. In the first 5 books of the Bible, there's all kinds of punishments that God will rain upon his people if they don't obey his commandments. There will be plagues. There will be illnesses. These are punishments for sins. Also, in a more positive way, perhaps, illness and health problems can be seen as a way of refining or testing the person. God is testing you. Through this period of refining, you will become closer to God. That's a common narrative if you read the lives of saints. They go through terrible illnesses, but they have faith in God because God is refining them through this process. One of the ways in which this can be dealt with at this level is through prayer, through repentance. We turn to God to heal us, or through religious ritual. Again, we're appealing to God, to the one who's ultimately responsible for our situation, to heal our situation by turning away from those bad things that we're doing that's bringing this situation about. Okay, orange. Now, orange is the level where we see the emergence of science, what we call science, for the first time in a significant way. So when illness strikes, orange will tend to look for rational and scientific reasons for the illness. Instead of appealing to demons, it's going to look for germs, bacteria, viruses. Makes a lot more sense than I'm being attacked by Satan at this level. And at this level, because we are analyzing our problems using rational and scientific means, we tend to look for a rational and scientific cure for the problem. And that's essentially what modern medicine is all about. Modern medicine originated and still has its home in orange. Reason, science. Green. Now at green, we're becoming more multi-perspectival. So in addition to modern medicine, and sometimes in more extreme forms instead of it, green will look for alternative forms of medicine, or what we would call alternative in modern culture, given that the mainstream is the orange scientific medicine. Green might tend to see illness as signifying that we are somehow out of balance. The organism is out of balance. Our energies are out of balance. Our mind and body are not in harmony with one another. We might see illnesses here as being very psychosomatic. I've been stressed for 10 years. Now I've got cancer, as an example. Some of the ways in which green might deal with illness is looking at alternative therapies, taking food supplements, fasting, healing, going to see healers. It might also, because it sees many illnesses as being psychosomatic in nature, it might also be looking at trying to resolve the underlying psychological issues that gave rise to this illness. And some therapies or some green approaches, Fritjof Chakra, for example, in his book, The Turning Point, takes this approach, that illness is not always a bad thing. Illness can be seen as part of the healing process. What we could see as the symptoms that if you go to your doctor, he'll say, well, this is bad, take this medicine. Green, some forms of green might say, well, those symptoms are actually symptoms of your body engaging in a deeper healing process. So allow the body to go through this process of what you call illness. So this is a much more holistic view of illness than we saw at orange. And we've gone significantly beyond the approaches of blue here and red. Now, yellow, one possible way that illness might be seen at yellow often sees life in evolutionary and developmental terms. One possible way in which, there are many others, but one example I'm giving here, is that illness can be seen as an opportunity for growth and development. Instead of seeing it merely as a bad thing, it's a situation that has arisen, and we can relate to it in a way that can further our growth and development. We can relate to it as an opportunity for learning about ourselves and maybe expanding our sense of self, expanding our sense of identity. And when we move to turquoise, I think we get the most sophisticated, all-embracing view of illness. And one way in which this could manifest is drawing on integral theory. We might take an all-quadrant view of illness. This would mean we look at 4 different domains of existence: subjective, objective, cultural, and social, which in integral theory are believed to be the 4 basic domains in which we exist. And we would look for ways that each of these quadrants is contributing to the illness that has arisen. So the different ways this could be seen: my mind is contributing to the illness through my thoughts and feelings. There are bodily causes for the illness: chemicals, hormones, germs. There are cultural reasons for the illness. Maybe my value system doesn't fit with the value system of the surrounding culture, which causes me tremendous stress. There's a cultural clash between where I am and the culture I have to live in, between me and my family. And the social quadrant, there could be things in the social systems in which I'm embedded that are causing me to fall ill. Family dynamics, at work, organizational dynamics. So what we are seeing here at turquoise is what we could call a holonic approach to illness, where a holon is defined as being made up of these 4 quadrants simultaneously. A holonic approach to illness would analyze illness, understand illness, treat illness by looking at all 4 of these aspects, all 4 of these causes simultaneously. They arise together, what we call tetra arising. So I'll take a 30-second break. So that's one way of understanding how spiral dynamics, how this model could give us an insight into how, as we develop, we may take different approaches to the issue of health and illness.
Does anyone have any questions?
I have a comment, if I may.
Yes, of course.
I'd like to expand a little on yellow. I think one of the gifts that yellow brings is systemic thinking. And when I think about health issues, for example, in the United States, we have a significant impact on health that's related to food deserts, because in poorer neighborhoods, particularly minority neighborhoods, access to fruits and vegetables and organic foods is significantly impaired. Plus the income levels are lower, they can't afford the better quality food, which contributes to eating more processed food, poor quality food, and potentially diabetes, cancer, and many other illnesses. So I think yellow has a very expansive perspective of the multiple systems that impact a person's health.
Thank you very much. Yes, you're absolutely right. Yes. I think yellow would see for the first time all of these levels in one glance, and it would be able to see how each of these levels is playing a role in the situation that we're seeing.
Yeah, and maybe multiple quadrants perspectives.
Yes.
Yeah. Now I have a question for you, Nish. At turquoise, my feeling is that turquoise develops a highly intuitive relationship with reality and might engage in diagnosis through intuition, so that the discernment of what the actual cause is not dependent upon medical systems testing, but could be using the patient's intuition or an outside person's intuition to help with the diagnosis. And then the healing would be engaging also potentially with intuition and spiritual echoes of purple. You know, it's often said that turquoise echoes purple. Would you agree?
Yes, I would agree. Yes, I think at turquoise, one of the things I found with turquoise is because we start to experience and enact a greater degree of body-mind integration, I think because of that integration, we are able to have a more intuitive sense of what is going wrong and how to deal with it. So yes, I think you're right. Yes, absolutely right. That kind of intuition would likely arise at turquoise, maybe in the higher echelons of turquoise. Any other questions or comments at this point?
Question, or maybe it's a comment. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, so this is Bet. When I first looked at this, I was thinking that you were going to talk about an entire society and the impact of that society being at that level on the citizens. But I realized this is the personal view of the person who's at each of these levels. Is that a right interpretation?
I think it is that, certainly, but maybe it also applies to, if it is a society, if the center of gravity of that society is at that level, then this would also be the dominant approach in that society. So if we're living in a strongly modern society, then modern medicine would be the dominant approach. Obviously, there would be individuals at lower levels, higher stages, but it's the individual, and it could also be seen as social, if that level represents the dominant center of gravity of that particular society.
I think it's interesting to think about where the gravity of a society is and then compare it to the illnesses that they have. Right. So Yemen right now is the hungriest country in the world according to this hunger index, global hunger index. And you look at their entire society, there's no blue structure. Like they've just fallen apart completely. And all these poor children are suffering at the beige level because they can't even get proper nutrition. So it's really interesting to see, to overlay the illnesses that are prevalent in the society based on where the gravity of that, and also to see as a whole society gradually moves up, every member of that society, no matter where they personally are going to benefit. Those children are all beige, but they're suffering this terrible, debilitating illness from malnutrition that they can never probably recover from, unfortunately.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, really good points. Yes, I think it would be an interesting thing to see if specific stages give rise to certain illnesses, if certain illnesses are more dominant at certain stages of development, whether individually or more likely in a society. So, for example, people do talk about a number of illnesses that are 20th century illnesses. So that hardly existed prior to the 20th century. So you wonder, is there something going on with orange that's bringing about those specific illnesses? So I think that would be an interesting thing to look at. And yes, the other point you made, I also agree. Even if there are in society, let's say you have an orange dominant society, even if you have individuals at earlier stages, which we certainly do, they would still benefit from modern medicine. I mean, you don't have to show a card saying that you're orange before you can go to hospital. The modern medicine that's arising at orange is available for all stages up to that level and beyond that level. Again, I think it's what's dominant at a given time in a given culture and society.
Nish, it's Sally here. I just wanted to say I think this is absolutely awesome. And I'm totally in full alignment with everything you've said, and always amazed at how articulately you weave it all together. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'm also curious, as a therapist, tracking how the perspective keeps shifting. So in the earlier stages, health is kind of dependent on your relationship with good and evil and God. It's all on God, kind of. There's a relationship where you get punished. So it's an external causation. And as we go through the stages, through orange, it's kind of all on us. There's no God. So modern medicine tries to say it's all on us and we're going to come up with all the answers, which is interesting. And then at the higher integrated stages.
I think Sally may have a connection problem there.
Temporal and spatial causation comes in.
Sally, you're breaking up
It's
quite a
kind
lot
of
with your connection.
Oh,
Okay, that seems a bit
is
better
it
now.
better?
Yeah,
So,
I think so.
as we get into integrated stages, the temporal it's not just all God, it's not just all us, there's also history and context. As Cindy pointed out, there's context.
Mhm.
Each neighborhood has different causations and identities come into it and economics come in. It's just beautiful, a mosaic unfolding in a third multiple dimension of time, space, and context as causation for health. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think this probably, the points that you make, excellent points, probably has something to do with the fact that as we develop, we move to more and more complex perspectives. We move from a first person to second person to third person to fourth person, even to fifth person perspectives. And as we develop in this way, we're able to see more and more of the bigger picture. So we can take on more and more possible causes because we're able to simply see more widely and more deeply into things.
Yeah, so I love this, Nish, and I just wanted to point out, it's so curious to me that two mainstreams, the Eastern Wake Up came on board well ahead, probably, 3,000 years ago, than the Grow Up, which is brand new. We're still learning that in the West. So it's really interesting to me how integrating these is the next level, and how the waking up aspect fell away for a long time due to rational modernity, and how that's coming back online at a second level of development. So like we started waking up long before we started growing up, and now we're integrating the both of them. I just think that's absolutely fascinating. They didn't co-arise at the same time. So there's kind of a sequence to this, as well as the 4 quadrants. Sequence through time, but now we have the ability to imagine that they co-arose in 4 quadrants. That's also interesting to me. And lastly, what I'm thinking about, as you said this so beautifully, is these are all ways of trying to alleviate suffering. So the ancient teachings are still so applicable. So every single stage you've itemized here is beautiful. It's more and more complex ways of alleviating suffering. Waking up and growing up are all ways of alleviating suffering. So that early insight of the Buddha hasn't really changed. It's just complexified. It's fabulous. Thanks, Nish.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sally. So, Suma, shall we move on to the second application of spiral dynamics to understanding the chakra system? Would that be...
Absolutely. Thank you for this, everyone.
thank you.
Next topic is application of spiral dynamics to chakra system.
Great. So if you can give me just a moment to share my screen there. Okay, can you see that? Yep, great. Now, first of all, I want to thank Bet, who's on the call, for designing these 2 slides. I've stolen these from a great presentation she gave a few months ago on the relationship between yoga and spiral dynamics. So what I'll do is I'll give a quick go through these, and then I'll also invite, if I've missed anything out or if there's more detail that should go in, I'll invite Bet to step in for a few minutes just to fill in the gaps, because she's an accomplished yoga teacher. She'll know more about this than I would. So chakras, as I'm sure you're all aware, are considered to be, in some of the Eastern traditions, particularly in the Hindu tradition of yoga, which includes the Kundalini yoga, to be energy centers that exist at various points up the middle of the body, typically up the spine. And each of these chakras is said to correspond to different aspects of our physical and emotional life. So I'll quickly run through these. We won't have time to go into these in great detail, but I'll give you the basic idea. Again, I know many of you may already be familiar with this. So at the base of the body, we have the root chakra, which corresponds to our basic needs and our basic sense of safety and security. The second chakra, moving up, the sacral chakra, that corresponds to our self-worth, our desire and experience of pleasure, our sexuality, our creativity. This is where we find creative expression arising for the first time. The solar plexus chakra, the third chakra, this is where we develop our self-esteem and our self-confidence, and with that comes a sense of personal power. The fourth chakra, the heart chakra, this is the chakra associated with love, and it's associated with that sense of connection to others. The fifth chakra, the throat chakra, this chakra is associated with truth and with the communication of that truth. The sixth chakra, which is known as the third eye chakra, it's a well-known notion, a third eye in the middle of our foreheads. That's associated with intuition, with wisdom, with the ability to see the big picture. And finally, the final chakra in most systems is said to be the crown chakra. And the crown chakra is associated with the life's ultimate purpose, which is to do with spirituality and enlightenment. So I think it's already starting to become clear how this might correlate to some degree with the stages of spiral dynamics that we saw earlier. So what I will now try to do is to take that down. And here we have the correlations made a bit more explicit. So I'll run through this and then hand over to Bet. So the root chakra, security, is very much associated with beige and purple. That's where we're trying to survive, and we get a basic sense of security and safety from belonging to the tribe. The second chakra, creative expression. Now this arises along with our sense of the beginnings of belonging to the tribe, the beginnings of the ego. So this we can see as being associated in some way with purple and red. The third chakra is to do with personal power. That we can see very much correlating with red, which is all about seeing the universe, seeing the world as a struggle for power for the ego, which is emerging for the first time. The fourth chakra, which is the chakra associated with love. This perhaps we can see as correlating to some degree with blue. It's at blue that I think the notion of love starts to emerge in a significant way for the first time in the religious traditions. And also love is almost given as a very fundamental commandment in some of these major traditions. Christianity is a very major example of that. It's through love, ultimately, even if it's just a commandment, that we bring about order in society, consideration for others. Truth, that fifth chakra, we can see that as being associated. Now, I think that can be associated in different ways through blue, orange, and green. Blue will see truth as being revealed to us. Orange is where truth really comes on board with seeing the world in terms of a third person perspective. And we even start to see truth as multi-perspectival in green. Everything is true for anybody who believes it. So truth starts to come on board as a major contributing factor at these levels: blue, orange, green, particularly orange and green. Wisdom. Now, I think wisdom, this is our intuition here arising at the third eye, where we start to see the big picture. And I think this is very much arising at yellow. At yellow, we start to see the big picture. We even start to be concerned about it for the first time. How does everything fit together? Systems of systems, development. This almost intuitive understanding of how the big picture fits together is associated, can be associated, could be said to be associated with this sixth chakra, the third eye. And the seventh chakra, which is referred to here as enlightenment, that is, we could see, starts to come on board in a significant way at turquoise. Here we start to see what life's purpose really is, and we develop that deeper spiritual insight and intuition, that really deep insight into the holistic nature of reality. So I'm going to hand over to Bet, if you wanted to say anything here to expand on what I've very quickly gone through there.
Thank you so much, Nish. This is really an honor to have this slide I threw together 10 minutes before my presentation. The best things are done with a deadline. So what I'm really seeing when I work with my own students and in myself is holes in our spiral is where we have our problems that we need to work on, both growing up and waking up. So growing up, you can think about building discipline, building a plan, building a schedule, building skills and tools. And you could even see how these sort of growing up things can lay over the chakras and the spiral. Really, I see them very closely mapped. So I'm not going to dive all into it, but you can sort of see like growing up is taking action. And you can't just sit on a mountain. I mean, maybe some people can and just be awoken, right? We need to take action in the world, and we have to build a schedule and a discipline and the tools and community and making a plan. So that's like where I see the growing up on this. And then the waking up is the slowing down and letting the intuitions come to us. It's the developing of our senses, being able to just see things around us, because what we tend to have in our Western society is this extremely narrow focus that we just spend our time looking at our cell phone. So we need to broaden just the eyes, listening more to the subtle cues that are happening in our environment, being able to feel things where our skin, we just completely ignore all of these beautiful senses that we have. And then there's other senses that, like Sheldrake talks about, Rupert Sheldrake, where there's morphic fields and there's all these other things that we don't even take the time in our Western culture to slow down and recognize. So I think waking up is just slowing down, feeling the intuitions, developing our senses, seeing and noticing, feeling our shared purpose and our own personal purpose, noticing that our actions are impacting the world. I think that's something children don't realize. That a lot of people don't, they're just victims constantly. Like, I don't understand, why is everyone picking on me? Then noticing that there's things outside of our control. It's not all, I think this goes back to things that were said earlier. Like, it's not just us. We can't do everything. We can't just be this strong individual, which is sort of coming from an orange layer or a red layer. So we need to recognize that there are lots of things going on that we don't even have the ability. We can still accept and work on that. So those are just a few more extra thoughts that I have with the growing up and waking up. And I know we're probably going to jump further into that.
Thank you very much, Bet. Thank you.
Sure.
So, Suma, shall I move on to the third
Nish,
application?
could I
Or,
just say something briefly
of course,
while you
please
have
do.
this?
Please do.
What I'm loving is that spiral dynamics tracks the warm and cool movement between stages. So first we're going warm, then we're going cool. And what I love about the chakra model is it's not actually in this image, but the hatha nadis, the left and right side, has been known about for 3,000 years and is not given credit in the spiral dynamics image, but that's what has been intuitively understood by the great mystics, that we have the feminine and masculine, warm and cool currents operating all the time. And so that also maps beautifully here. These chakras, but what's not drawn are the nadis, the hanta, the masculine and feminine. But spiral dynamics also follows that with the movement from left to right, or cool and warm. So these truths are very ancient. We've just got a modern map. So I just want to acknowledge the great mystics that knew this. And now we have Ian McGilchrist's deep research into the brain, who has really come up with solid evidence that it's actually the right and the left brain that are integrating. So what the yogis knew intuitively, what spiral dynamics mapped, and now what Ian McGilchrist has proven is that integration happens between yin and yang at all levels. It's so amazing. Thanks.
Can I jump in, Nish, to comment
Of
on
course,
that one?
yeah.
So, Sally, I'm going to take your challenge and I'm going to update this to have the right brain, left brain with waking up, growing up maps onto this, because I'm in the middle of Ian McGilchrist's book and it's just fantastic. And if anyone on here hasn't read it yet, it's really great, especially as a yoga teacher, right? Because a lot of the exercises that we're doing are balancing that. So I think bringing balance and integrating is so critical. But Sally, thank you for bringing that up, and I'm going to take it as a challenge to update this slide.
I think that's what integration has always meant to yoga. We just didn't have the knowledge to look at the upper right quadrant into the brain. So that's a phenomenal new orange development, that we can actually look at the brain and understand what yoga's always meant about integration. And it shows up on left and right sides of the body. Yeah, great bit. I'd love to see that.
I heard this other metaphor of eventually all these colors collapse and it's like a clear light. That was an interesting way to look at where merging of all these colors like that. And it also kind of matches with the metaphor of light, like how light encompasses all different colors. So that was interesting. But moving on to our next topic, how does spiral dynamics apply to enlightenment?
Thank you. And thank you very much, Sally and Beth, for your excellent comments there. So our third and final application of spiral dynamics, before we move on to any further comments and then to waking up. So if you can give me a moment, please. Okay. So can you all see this okay? Great. So what I'm going to be looking at here is how is it that the different levels of development might understand the mystical experience. So this is our third consideration. We've looked at health and illness. We've looked at chakras. So the final application I'm going to be looking at today is the mystical experience. If we assume that mystical experience of some kind can happen at any level of development, then each level of development, because of its worldview may interpret that mystical experience in very different ways. And these are just examples. Obviously, there may well be many other ways in which this can happen. So I'm starting off here by just defining what we mean by the mystical experience. So I'm defining the mystical experience as an experience that the experiencer believes represents a direct and noetic experience, some kind of direct and noetic experience of a higher reality or of the true nature of reality. That's my working definition. And the assumption here that I think is backed up with some evidence is that mystical experiences are available at every level of the spiral, from purple to turquoise. But each of these levels will understand and express these experiences in different ways. So I'll run through these. These are again just examples. So purple may understand and express the mystical experience as some kind of magical communion with the spirit world. We see this particularly in the shamanic traditions. There's a spirit world. We're communing in some magical way with that spirit world. That's our mystical experience. Red may interpret the mystical experience as a way of tapping into the source of all power. We see this in ancient India, the Vedic rishis who used fire rituals as ways to tap into what they saw as the source of all power, which initially they called Brahman. Red is all about power. It interprets the mystical experience in terms of power. We're going to the root of it all. Where does it all come from? Blue, this is where we see traditional religion arising. Here, the mystical experience could be interpreted as a way of engaging in communion or union with God. We see this in the mysticism of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The ultimate mystical reality here is God. And the mystical experience is a way of communing with God, or ultimately even achieving some kind of union with God. Orange. Now, orange is moving into what we can call a third person perspective. This is where we attempt to see reality in a third person way, independent as far as we can. This lies behind the notion of objectivity, independent as far as we can of any first person or second person, any subjective or cultural influence. So here, the mystical experience could be interpreted as a direct perception of reality or truth. There's a truth out there that has to be perceived and found, and the mystical experience gives us a direct perception or apprehension of that reality or truth. This is the kind of language we see in some schools of Vedanta and certainly in early Theravada Buddhism. And actually, these traditions historically arose at times when the earliest explorers of orange, such as in ancient Greece, were also starting to emerge around about the Axial Age. Green. How might green understand the mystical experience? Green might understand the mystical experience as some kind of harmony or oneness with the universe. To green consciousness, the universe is this holistic, harmonious place. We have problems because we move out of that harmony. We lose sight of that oneness. The solution, the remedy is to rediscover that harmony, to rediscover that oneness. So our mystical experience is a way of rediscovering that harmony or oneness with the universe. One tradition that in its most philosophical versions talks in these terms is Taoism. In the Tao Te Ching, for example, you can see allusions to this kind of interpretation. Yellow, again, as we saw with health and illness, yellow tends to see things, or can see things. One version of yellow is to interpret reality in terms of development. We can see systems within systems. Each new system comes on board as we evolve to a higher level of development. So mystical experience itself here could be interpreted in terms of evolution. And we see this in the writings of Aurobindo. Aurobindo would see mystical experience as being an indication of some of the higher levels of development and evolution. And enlightenment, in Aurobindo's scheme, would be the very highest level of evolution, what he called the supermind. This is where we've reached the end of development in Aurobindo's scheme. So that we could see that as a way that yellow might interpret the mystical experience and the entire mystical journey. Turquoise, at turquoise, one of the experiences at turquoise that can arise is a deep integration between body and mind and a deep rediscovery of embodiment that has been lost along the way, especially at sort of blue-orange. And this rediscovery of the body, this deep embodiment, which is a characteristic of some versions of turquoise, some experiences of turquoise, we see that in some of the tantric traditions, such as Shaivism and Vajrayana. And the mystical experience here, when appropriate, could be seen or interpreted as the enlightenment of the whole body. Our body participates with the cosmic body. Our individual human body, we realize it to be an instance of the body of the whole cosmos, and the whole body vibrates in tune with that vibration of the whole cosmos. This is the kind of way that some of the tantric traditions might speak of enlightenment, and that we could see that as a turquoise interpretation. So again, just another way in which we can see how the spiral dynamics model might shed insight into why these different interpretations exist and how they might relate to each other developmentally.
Does anyone have any comments?
Yeah, thanks, Suma. Sorry, I just wanted to point out this beautiful map that you've shared with us before about religious experience developing. But also, Nish, you did mention earlier the right and the left brain. And so what I'm seeing with your map here is the movement from deep subjectivity in the pre-personal through to objectivity in the rational, through to a subject and object integration in the transrational. So there's telos here, there's movement through time in our capacity to use our focus. We shift from deep subjectivity to deep objectivity, both of which were not that effective ultimately. And now at second tier, we're doing both subjective and objective as perspective shifts. That is a brand new capacity in the human brain. Now we can do at least 4 perspectives with Ken's beautiful 4-quadrant model, which can be applied to anything. But really at the core of the body is this left brain ability to either have narrow focus or wide focus. And the wider the focus, we call that meditation. And the narrower the focus, we call that applied problem solving. So this capacity now to use both is absolutely an amazing new potential. But just noticing that we can't do this without development. So at the core of this is personal development and development over time of what I would call collective perception of reality, from subjective to objective to both. And what I'm tracking is this telos, or the movement, psychic movement of our capacity to use both foci. We move from binaries to what I would call a polarity, to complementarity, to unity. So that's why I still call it the Tao, even though my Tao is second tier Tao that I teach, because of that basic movement in the human psyche. That is the development that is potential in all of us in one lifetime. That reflects the development of culture over millennia. So we can now do in one lifetime what the whole of humanity has learned to do over millennia. That's a miracle. That is the embodied enlightenment right there, that we can do that in one life. So thank you for this map. I'm so excited, Nish, that you can say this so articulately.
Thank you very much, Sally. Yeah, great points. Thank you. I mean, we could speculate that, as we'll see a bit later, that if at the higher levels of growing up, we see some kind of merging between growing up and waking up, that we could speculate that this entire movement of development is a movement of the unification of the left and right sides of the brain in due course.
Hi, Nish. Thanks for
Hi, Steve.
this great presentation. Yeah, I just wanted to echo some of what Sally was saying there, but in a different kind of language almost. What's coming up for me is a kind of psychological progression in terms of metaphors that are based on kind of the locus of authority. So initially it's within the family or the tribal chieftain, and that gets projected into the kind of spiritual entities, you know, writ large. So, you know, the father above, or the, you know, the heroes or whatever. And then as that moves, we move more into a sort of humanism, then it becomes truth, and it's in ourself. We become the kind of source, and our ability to discern truth becomes the source of authority and power. And then it kind of goes through to community and into a kind of a sort of holistic, all-embracing authority and power. So I'm kind of seeing that trend, which is maybe just another way of you know, describing what the kind of movement Sally was describing. But how does that play with you?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that makes total sense to me. Yeah, I think there is a sense in which it's inevitable that we will understand the spiritual domain, including our spiritual experiences, in terms of what we are, because subject and object ultimately, we could say, are not different at the level of wholeness. So we may presume them to be different by virtue of our self-contraction and the arisal of the separate self, but there is this deeper wholeness at play, whether we're aware of it or not. And because of that, I think subject and object must reflect each other to some degree. There is a saying that we don't see the world as it is, but as we are. And I think this applies to the way that we apprehend the spiritual domain too. I think this is reasonably well accepted when it comes to personal gods, for example, or the one personal God. But I think what's probably less in view is that I think this applies just as much to impersonal philosophies as well. Even when we see the spiritual domain as reality, as truth, as harmony, as oneness, as development, as the enlightenment of the whole body, we haven't suddenly dispensed with projection. We're still projecting in more sophisticated and subtle ways what we are onto the way that we apprehend the spiritual domain. And I don't think we ever really get beyond that until perhaps there's a complete coalescing of subject and object. And even then, I think when we want to express it in the manifest world, we're still going to have to adopt some kind of framework. So yeah, excellent point, Steve. Thank you. Thank you very much. Actually, Rupert Sheldrake, there's a wonderful quote from Rupert Sheldrake. I'm going to try to remember it. He says that, talking about this way we project what we are onto, or what we create onto our understanding of the world, he says that the scientific mechanical view of the world is completely anthropomorphic, because machines are entirely human creations. So we haven't gone beyond projection just because we're no longer seeing things in religious terms. We're still projecting in material terms. And I think that's unavoidable because of this deeper oneness between the subject and the object.
So Nish, may I ask a question?
Please do, yeah.
As we're looking at the mystical experience, that's often equated with waking up versus growing up. Are we in the waking up conversation now?
No, sorry, if I didn't make that clear enough. No, this is still the growing up conversation. So, but what I'm looking at here is how do the different levels of growing up interpret the waking up states? How do the different structures interpret the mystical state? I'm just I know there are different states, so I'm just coalescing them into one for this discussion. The mystical experience, which is waking up, how is that actually interpreted at different levels of growing up? So sorry if I didn't make that clear enough. This is still part of the growing up consideration.
Yeah, I think you did say it. I'm just trying to discern for myself separation here, because there's so much confusion and conflation of people who think that it is the mystical experience that defines growing up, that if you have a mystical experience, you are at the top of the spiral. And I think that's it. Maybe we save that conversation for the growing up page when we get there.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, great point. Yeah, I mean, my view is that mystical experiences can take place at almost any level of the spiral. Mystical experiences were taking place tens of thousands of years ago when we were primarily at purple and red. And the actual essence of that mystical experience may well have been the same as what we're experiencing today, but the way it was interpreted and expressed would have been very different, because it's being expressed through those conceptual filters that we have available to us. So waking up is expressed in different ways depending on how far we've grown up.
Yes, yes. And maybe being careful not to overprivilege the mystical experience, because some people are less prone to them and some people are more prone to them, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And what my thesis here is that the growing up and waking up are both equally important. We don't privilege either. They're both equally important parts of what it might mean to have this global, non-dual view.
See, Nish, what I find interesting when people discuss, say, perennial philosophy, that there are core truths that can be revealed through time. And what I'm finding amazing is that you've itemized here Taoism, yoga as understood by Aurobindo, and yoga as understood by tantric traditions as being at second tier, and they emerged well over 2,500 years ago. So that to me is amazing, that people could go deep into meditation and access truths that are still beyond most of our population. So the waking up mystical experience doesn't relate to the growing up sophistication of our culture. These are deep access to, I don't know, people could call it the Akashic records, through certain states that can be cultivated. And to me, that is not really recognized fully at Integral often, that some of the most ancient truths should never be bypassed as a sign of being somehow unsophisticated and out of date. Or yeah, and to me, what I see here, objective, subjective, the movement is between merging and emerging. To me, that's the best descriptor. So the mystical states are emerging, the oneness, and that's the wake up, and the grow up is how to emerge, how to individuate, how to show up, and how to act. So to me, that's the basic core binary. I didn't invent that. It's been known for some time that emerge and merge need to cooperate, and that's the integral level. First of all, we were merging, we were very merged. Then through the rational objectivity, we emerged as individuals, and now we're learning how to do both in context that is fluid and applicable to our time and space. Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah, thank you very much. Really good points. And again, my speculation is that this merging and emerging binary that you're pointing to here has some kind of correlation with the left and right brain. And
So that's the one issue I have about the naming of emergentism, because it's not seeing the other half.
Right. Yes.
That was a nice overview on growing up phase. Nish, can you elaborate more on the waking up phases?
Yes, certainly. So we'll move on to the waking up side of the equation. So I'll just check you can see this, my circle model, what I call the circle model. So what I'm going to do is do a quick overview of the circle model, and then from the circle model, we can see how the different stages of waking up might emerge. Very quick, like 10 minutes or so. So the circle model is basically an attempt to depict the structure of reality as spoken of and taught by some of the major Eastern traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, particularly. So if you look on the right side of the circle model first, that's the side that I'm referring to as the side of form or light. This represents that aspect of reality that can enter into awareness. This is stuff that we can experience and see. And some of the ancient sages spoke of this realm of form as consisting of three great realms of being: the gross, the subtle, and the causal. The gross is the sensory motor world. This is books and rivers and rocks and houses and bodies. And we are in this gross world when we're awake. Those 16 hours a day or so that we're awake, we are accessing this gross realm of being. The subtle realm of being, this is effectively our inner world. This is the world of emotions, the mind, the higher mind, the archetypes in the highest regions of the mind. And this realm of being we access when we are dreaming. This is the dream state. And we can access it when we're awake as well, through meditation, through shamanic visions. And the subtle realm consists of emotions, images, thoughts, visions, and so on. The causal realm, the third great realm of being, this is the realm that the sages refer to as emptiness or formlessness. This is when we experience that blissful release from all gross and subtle forms, and we are plunged into void. And again, every day, every 24 hours, we typically spend some time in this state, in this realm, when we are asleep but not dreaming. This is the realm of deep, dreamless sleep. So every 24 hours, we're cycling through these three realms. The teaching in some of the traditions, like Vedanta is the obvious one, but in different ways it's taught in Buddhism and even Taoism and Jainism, certainly, that even while we're circling through these realms or moving through these realms quite naturally each day, there is a part of us, a deepest essence in us that doesn't change, that's changeless. And that is the left side of the circle here, which I'm calling emptiness or consciousness. That is the true self with a capital S, that's always constant, changeless. And that cannot be experienced because that's the one who experiences. That's the seer who sees, but which cannot, or who cannot himself or herself be seen. And this emptiness or consciousness is referred to in Vedanta as Turiya, which means the fourth state. So we have these three basic realms of being in the realm of form and light, 1, 2, 3. The fourth state, which is constant, is Turiya. And this is that pure observing awareness of the three states. This is that part of us, usually unrealized, but still operating in the background, that's always aware of these three states. Because usually when these three realms of being are being cycled through every 24 hours, we are identifying with some kind of subject in the realm of form. But the true subject behind it all is emptiness or consciousness, in which these three realms are arising. This emptiness consciousness is referred to as the true self, as transcendental awareness, as the ever-present self, as divine consciousness. These are all different ways these are referred to. And typically this is the realization of sages. Sages, very generically, a sage is somebody who realizes consciousness, emptiness as their true identity, the witness consciousness behind these changing forms of gross, subtle, causal. Non-duality is the realization that ultimately, though even consciousness and form, emptiness and form, consciousness and light, the left and right sides of this circle are not really different, but the ultimate state of being is the union of the two, conscious light. In Hinduism, this is called conscious light. In the Kashmir Shaivism tradition, for example, In Mahayana, Vajrayana Buddhism, this is referred to by the insight, emptiness is form. There's ultimately no difference between the emptiness or consciousness that's ever present and the form and the light, which is always changing. Nirvana is samsara. So this conscious light is referred to in Vedanta as Turiya Tita, which is the fifth state or beyond the fourth state. So we've gone even beyond Turiya on the left here, and Turiya has in effect gone back to form and realized that form is not different from itself. In Zen Buddhism, this is the return to the marketplace, the 10th of the ox herding pictures. We realize all these amazing things, but then we just return to the marketplace and realize that this messy, horrible world is actually not different from the highest realization. They're different aspects of conscious light. Emptiness is form. This is the real non-duality. This is also ever present, although usually unrealized. And we can refer to this as unqualifiable spirit. Now, waking up, which is the other type of evolution or development, which exists alongside growing up, relatively independent from growing up, we can think of that as an awakening to deeper aspects of this circle. In other words, deeper and more expansive, all-including aspects of this total reality of conscious light. So I'll run through very quickly 5 types of mysticism, 5 states that would correspond to these 5 elements of the circle model. So at the gross level, what we could see here is nature mysticism. This is a deep connection with our physical environment, emerging with nature. The mountains, the ocean, the sunset, it's all part of me. It's all permeated with the divine light, and I'm not different from all of that. And this is the realm of the shaman. The shaman typically may be moving in these kind of states. As we move into the subtle, we experience what we could call deity mysticism. So this is the second waking up stage or state stage. First is nature mysticism, the gross. Second is the subtle. And here we can talk in terms of deity mysticism. A deity mystic will talk in terms of having had a profound encounter with the divine. He will have come face to face with light, with love, with energy, with a personal deity. And at the pinnacle of the subtle, he will merge with he may merge with some kind of personal God. I've become in deep communion or even union with Jesus, with the Buddha, with Shiva. And the mystics that experience deity mysticism here at the subtle, typically we refer to them as saints or prophets. So we could speculate that examples of these would be Moses, that the prophet Muhammad, Abraham. These experienced God in some kind of subtle form as deity, as personal God. And most of these at the blue level of growing up would talk of that in terms of a creator of the universe. Moving up to causal, the type of waking up state that we would experience here, we could call formless mysticism. So here we experience an absorption in the void. Nothing arises here. This is the impersonal God. We met the personal God at the subtle. We meet the impersonal God at the causal, or in Christian mystics would say God at the subtle level. But at the causal level, the Christian mystic, for example, Meister Eckhart, would refer to that as the Godhead in contrast to God. So this is the impersonal ground of all being, where nothing is arising, but everything arises out of that and returns back into that. In Hinduism, this is Nirvikalpa Samadhi, an absorption in the void. This is Nirodha in Buddhism, a temporary entrance into the stream in Theravada Buddhism. And typically we could speculate that realizers of this state were the Buddha, Lao Tzu, maybe even Jesus. When Jesus says, I and the Father are one, might he have been referring to some kind of causal state there, when he achieves absolute union with the Godhead to such a degree that it's no longer at the subtle, it's my Father is greater than I. But at the causal, it's I and the Father are one. Moving into the witness consciousness on the left there, this is our fourth waking up state. which we could refer to as witness consciousness. Here we move into a pure featureless awareness. We become identified with that pure featureless awareness, and we effortlessly, stationed here at consciousness, we effortlessly witness these three states, gross, subtle, and causal, arising, but without identifying with any of them. And that's why here we're free of suffering, because all suffering occurs on the right here. Suffering, for there to be suffering, there have to be objects that are moving and bumping into each other. Multiplicity, fragmentation, it's all happening on the right side. And because we identify with objects in the right side, typically my physical body, this is me, we suffer. When we realize our truer identity in this fourth waking up state, the state of the witness consciousness, we've gone beyond suffering, because we're no longer identified with anything that can be threatened, hurt, or anything that can die. This emptiness consciousness, witness consciousness, this is the seer, as I mentioned before, this is the seer that cannot himself, herself, itself be seen. And finally, the fifth, and at least as far as we know at the moment, the final waking up state, is the non-dual mysticism, which would correlate here with conscious light, which is the wholeness, non-dual state of the entire circle. Here, what we realize is that the witness on the left is none other than any of the states on the right. It's all non-different to each other. And whereas the realizer of the fourth state, the witness consciousness, we could call the sage in Hinduism and maybe Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism maybe, the realizers of this fifth non-dual mysticism are referred to as siddhas, or completed ones. We've reached the final completeness of that circle. And realizers, at least in terms of intuition, and maybe in terms of embodiment, we don't really know, that we can see in the traditions are Nagarjuna, maybe, the founder of Madhyamika Buddhism. Now, whereas the Buddha was very much the fourth state, we have to escape suffering, move to the left. Nirvana is different to samsara. Nagarjuna, who was the founder of Madhyamika and later Mahayana Buddhism, argued and realized, perhaps, that there's no difference between nirvana and samsara. Nirvana and samsara themselves are merely different aspects of emptiness's form, reality with a capital R, or in Hinduism, what we call conscious light. Another realizer of this might have been Shankara, the founder of Advaita Vedanta. Another realizer of this might have been Abhinavagupta, the founder of Kashmir Shaivism. And in the West, certainly in terms of theoretical models, we can see this in Neoplatonism, perhaps, that everything comes out of this ultimate unity and returns to the ultimate unity, and nothing is ultimately different to this ultimate unity. We can see that in the highest interpretations of Neoplatonism, which was founded by Plotinus. So this is the general scheme of waking up. Nature mysticism at gross, deity mysticism at subtle, formless mysticism at causal, witness consciousness at emptiness consciousness, and finally the non-dual mysticism, the non-dual state at conscious light or emptiness's form. And as we've hinted before, these are temporary, or in some cases even permanent, state realizations. But when we want to talk about it and express it in the world, we will do so using the stage of growing up that we've looked at earlier, that we have reached. Historically, most mystics have probably been blue, because most mystics historically tended to be within a religious tradition and have tended to talk through that religious tradition. But of course, there are mystics earlier than that and later than that. So waking up states, we move around the circle model, express those states through the growing up states, which we looked at with spiral dynamics.
Hi, Nish, I've got a question for you, if that's okay.
Please.
It's to do with the role of the conceptual mind, because obviously, you know, within the Buddhist, particularly sort of Tantric Buddhist tradition, Going beyond conceptual mind is a key developmental, key stage in this whole waking up process. And the bodhisattvas are all meant to be beyond concept, and so forth. So, and slightly preempting your sort of union of growing up and waking up, we tend to think of the growing up very much in conceptual terms. Even second tier, there's still a lot of concepts kind of knocking around. So how do you see those two sitting side by side? Because I mean, just to sort of qualify that a bit more, obviously within, say, tantric Buddhism, even when you realize the fifth state, there's still effectively, there's a lot of activity. It's like the realized masters are very, very active. They're meant to be sort of super active. So even though they know there's nothing to be done effectively. So I'm just sort of trying to sense into that kind of little niche there, if that's okay.
Yeah, great question. I would say that when the great teachers talk about going beyond concept, they're talking about states rather than stages. It's in these state experiences that the conceptual mind is temporarily switched off or seen through or gone beyond. There's some kind of non-conceptual direct apprehension of reality, whether that's gross, subtle, causal, whatever. But even if that direct apprehension of reality is non-conceptual beyond concept, when we come out of that state, or if it's a permanent state realization alongside that state, when we want to talk about it, because all of these masters still talk to their disciples and talk about going beyond concept. When you're talking about going beyond concept, you have to use concepts to do that. So I would say that the states are beyond concept. That's what they're referring to. But the teachings based on those states, or the methodologies that are practiced in order to reach those states, to invoke those states, are necessarily conceptual, because we're living in a real manifest world and we navigate this world through concepts. So I think there's the interplay between states and stages. Part of that is this interplay between beyond concept and concept. And we can even speculate further that it's not only that the stages are used to, okay, just give me a moment. Let me just admit Michael into the waiting room. Sorry, it's not only that the stages are used to interpret the states afterwards, but even in the midst of those state experiences, those state experiences that might be partially constructed rather than merely disclosed, such as the subtle state maybe, our stage of development might even be playing a role in the very construction of that state experience, while that state experience is actually going on in some cases. So a Christian mystic is not likely to see Vishnu, they're likely to see Christ. Whereas a Hindu mystic is not likely to see Christ, they're likely to see Vishnu. Are these guys experiencing exactly the same state, but just interpreting it differently? Or do their separate conceptual interpretations even play a role in the construction of the surface structure of that state? And this is a big debate in the philosophy of mysticism. We don't really know for sure. But yeah, I hope that answers your question somewhat.
That was a that was a really cool distinction. Thank you for that. I have a slightly different question, which is the tendency to make state experiences necessary for growing up is a question I hold. And I think some people are highly state experience prone and some people are not. So if you were going to rate people on a scale of like 1 to 10 for how much they're likely to experience these mystical states, can someone who's at a 1 still climb the ladder of development? And my feeling is they can, but I can't articulate why I feel that. So just throwing it out there.
Yeah, I mean, my view, and this is tentative, it could be wrong. My view is that states and stages, until we reach very high stages, probably turquoise in our current language, are relatively independent. So we could have somebody who's very good at moving to high states, but is operating at a low level of growing up. We could have somebody who's very grown up, has no experience of the states. And we could have somebody who's very competent in both. I think we could probably find examples of all of these permutations historically and even in the contemporary world. Now, I'll give you a couple of examples. I mean, we have examples, I think, of Zen masters, for example, in Japan, who were relatively enlightened Zen masters, and so operating at very high states, at least causal or emptiness consciousness, even conscious light, maybe, emptiness is form, but who were very strong Japanese nationalists and who very much might have supported the war between the Japanese and the Chinese. So we have an example there of somebody who's at a very high stage, causal, non-dual, but who's still operating at a relatively early structure, blue, nationalist blue. And we could even see examples of the opposite, I think. We may have exceptional business leaders who are operating at yellow, strong yellow, clear perception of development, clear perception of systems and meta systems, paradigms, but who have pretty much no experience of state development beyond the normal gross waking state. So, and obviously I think we can have individuals who are very competent at both. So my view at the moment tends to be that they're relatively independent from one another. Whether or not competency with states accelerates stage growth, again, I would have to see the evidence. I think I can understand theoretically why that might be the case, because I think one of the dynamics that takes place as we move through the stages, one way to describe it is that what was previously subject now becomes object. At each level, as we ascend to the next level, we can see the presumed subject of the previous level, which we couldn't at the previous level, which means we can now see through the assumptions and the filters of the previous level as object. But now, of course, we develop a new subject at that higher level, and that process continues. Subject becomes object, new subject, subject becomes object, new subject. That ability to see the subject as object requires a certain flexibility of attention and consciousness. And I think that is quite related to the flexibility of attention and consciousness that is developed through state training. So that is why maybe they say meditation, which is a primary form of state training, might accelerate growing up, because you're getting competent in that dynamic of what was subject becomes object. So just some possible thoughts there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry, Michael.
Can I get in this?
Sure, please.
Yeah, I've had this question for a long time, and when I was interviewing Ken for the book that I wrote on integral stuff, he was quite insistent that I don't know that he used the term orthogonal, but that they're independent, waking up and growing up. But there's something that happens at higher levels of growing up where I don't think that's true. I mean, I think that's similar to what you're saying. I mean, the research says, at very high levels of development, Torbert, Bill Joyner, that they all have meditation practices, because it's it's not that it's required, earlier, but at some point to make the subject object switch, you've got to go to witness, it seems like. So meditation helps you see your own development more clearly, or clears something. So that's,
yeah, that makes sense to me. I mean, if we look at the circle model, I've presented the circle model as a model for waking up, but if we think of the circle model as a model for growing up, what might be happening at turquoise is where moving to the absolute upper echelons of gross. And I think in order to do that and open ourselves up to subtle, we may well require this subject-object switching facilitation that you're referring to there, that you're alluding to there, that comes on board with meditation practice. Maybe, yeah. Shall I stop this share? We can continue discussion. Yeah. Does that make sense, Michael?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Sally?
I'd love to expand on that. And I think Michael's
sure.
absolutely right. So I just want to bring into the conversation, I've had experience with yoga as well as integral psychology. So how I understand states and stages, I'll just say that I brought those bodies of knowledge together. And this is what I'm seeing. I think meditation is the route for gaining objectivity over subjectivity. So subjectivity being the body. So the mind where the witness is, starts to observe the body and all the body's goings on. That's a distance that we've gained, and a movement of identifying from the body to the wider perspective, which is the right brain's gift. So something is going on there that we can start to inhabit the right brain much more broadly and see the big picture. But I want to talk about your model specifically, Nish, which is the fullness and emptiness model. So how I see this is, how do we gain emptiness? It's by experiencing no thought. That is where we actually feel the emptiness, when our mind is empty. How do we experience fullness? It's in the body. So, and I want to just briefly talk about that. So it's when the mind is empty and the body is felt, the bliss arises. The more you practice emptiness, the more you feel the bliss. That's the emptiness fullness that is experienced at the same time. My view of this from my yoga teacher training is we begin to then master the body itself, and states can become instant. And how we do that is dropping into theta and delta, as opposed to beta, where the mind is so busy, there are thoughts. So the slower our brain wave, the emptier our mind, but also things start emerging from the subconscious at that point. So it can still be busy until we start to distance ourselves from that and just begin to watch what is emerging. That state of emptiness, fullness, can only arise in parasympathetic. So there's nervous system mastery here. When we're in sympathetic, our mind is busy. That's not emptiness, there's fear. So things arise in response to fear. So soothing the nervous system, getting into parasympathetic, ancient yogic wisdom here, dropping into theta, alpha and then theta and sometimes delta, that emptiness is literally accessible. And then what happens is the brain chemistry changes and the neurotransmitters come online and we experience bliss. So this is not woo-woo. This is actual, accessible, really simple practice, but it has to be done over time. And the state that we can cultivate becomes the stage. So the more these states, and they're physical, they're simple physical states, once we understand the yogic technology of that through the breath, which comes between the causal and the gross. The breath is the subtle. That's the leap from gross to subtle. So mastering the breath, mastering the brain waves, mastering the parasympathetic nervous system, drop into the state, practice that all the time, the brain rewires its plastic, and then the state becomes the stage. And as that occurs, our perspective widens. So the stages of spiral dynamics can occur more fluidly and easily with no resistance, if possible. And that's when the emptiness and fullness is literally experienced in the same moment. Emptiness of thought, fullness of brain chemistry, and that's done often through the breath. It's a miracle. This is not woo-woo. So your model is experiential and it's real. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really loved your point that as we experience emptiness more deeply, we also experience fullness more deeply. And again, I think similar to something I said earlier, I think one reason for that might be that the ultimate state of affairs is that they're not different ultimately. So in a way, deepening one is going to deepen the other because they're reflections of that same, what I've called conscious light. And the emptiness and the fullness are just these subjective and objective poles of that conscious light. I also like the way you correlated some of this with brain waves, because I think that shows the correlation between these states and these states that we go through every 24 hours, waking, dreaming, dreamless sleep. In a way, mysticism is making the dream state and the deep dreamless sleep state conscious during the waking state. So we're able to access those brain waves consciously while we're awake. And also the other point that you made that I really liked was how as we move to the higher stages, the body becomes so important because it's in the body that we experience fullness. And this could be why, as we move into the turquoise stages of development, I think we almost necessarily experience a greater and deeper embodiment. I think it almost has to be the case there, because we're also starting to get a sense of that transpersonal self, which is situated, another way of expressing emptiness, and another way of talking about emptiness. Yeah, thank you very much, Sally. Does what I'm just said make sense? Hopefully it does.
Does anyone want to share their own waking up, growing up experiences? Or any other comments?
It occurs to me that for people like myself that are not prone to drama on the mystical side, there's no, oh my God, I just saw the whole universe moments. It's subtle, not meaning in the subtle causal gross way, but it's a subtle changing that has happened across time. And I'm wondering if there's a methodology that would be, you know, perhaps what we could contribute to the spiritual journey for people is to get beyond just talking about meditation as the pathway, because for not all people is meditation very meaningful or accessible or helpful. But, you know, psychotherapy and journaling is very self-reflective and insightful. Moments of intuition can hit you in the shower. You know, there's probably more richness that could be had around the conversation around states that enable stage growth beyond what we've tended to groove into, which is to be into meditation or into plant medicine as ways of having these breakthroughs. I think there's more there. I'm not quite sure how to articulate it, but I think there's more.
Yeah,
I think anything that lets us slow down, right? If we can just slow down, then things can come up, and it could just be like a tea ritual or cleaning the house slowly.
yeah, I mean,
Cleaning the house. I like that as a spiritual practice. Way to go. Slow down.
yeah, I mean, I really like your point, Cindy. And I think one way I look at this is that if we think of the subject-object distinction as, I mean, if you recall the diamond model, if we think of the subject-object distinction as being that fundamental dualism or distinction that arises out of wholeness, then the converse to that might be that there are two ways to realize wholeness. One is through the subject route, and one is through the object route, since both are manifestations of wholeness. Meditation is what I would call the subject route, because we're observing the subject, and by refining the subject and going through this subject becomes object process, emptiness and fullness, we realize this wholeness. But one of the things that's maybe less emphasized, and I think this is very relevant to somebody who practices Christianity, is the object route. So we can realize that wholeness through that deep investigation of the subject, which is what meditation is, but we can also realize that wholeness through that deep communion and surrender to the supreme object, which is what God is. So through prayer, through devotion, through devotion to God in the theistic traditions, through devotion to the guru in some of the Eastern traditions, like guru yoga in Tibetan Buddhism, or satsang in Hinduism, that might also be another route to experiencing this wholeness, an object-dominated route rather than a subject-dominated route. And I would agree that we don't tend to talk about that enough.
Yeah, Nish, I'd love to say that Ken always said growing up happened through turning subject into object. And I always thought, but it's the other way as well, turning object into subject. And so when Cindy talks about journalism, journaling, and I see Michael mentions music, what I'd like to say is any of the arts they're turning your object into subject. You actually become that as you practice it. Or once you've made the product, there's your beautiful object that has come out of your subject. So this object-subject thing is not only meditation. Cindy's perfectly right. I didn't want to bring this up, but all creative practice is a material Western way that we can observe growth. The creativity practice itself is an object-subject dialogue. We're continually creating objects out of our subject. And when we have made the object, it goes into culture and other people can experience the subject from that object. So there are definitely more ways to do this practice than just meditation. And as Bette says beautifully, going into nature does the same thing.
I think anything that perhaps loosens that hard dualism between subject and object through all these ways that you've mentioned are going to open us up to wholeness, which means they're going to open us up to state development. That's how I would see that.
And I'll use the Christian term grace. We don't know when grace will just happen.
Yep.
And basically, sorry, Nish, just briefly, that is the witness capacity, is the artist as well as the mystic. Those are the two great witnessing capacities.
I was just going to say that there is a saying, which is that enlightenment is an accident and spiritual practice makes you accident prone. So there's no way of guaranteeing this. We can just open ourselves up to it, and then grace will happen when it happens. We can't force development growing up or waking up. Krishnamurti said all you can do is leave your window open and hope that the breeze will blow in. So all of this is ways to leave the window open. And then we wait for grace to act as it will, not as we will.
Can I offer two things, maybe in response to Cindy's question? For me, I'm just things that are kind of commonly or easily accessible. I think one is reflecting on dreams, but not in a kind of Freudian or even Jungian sense necessarily, where you're looking to further explore the ego story in a more surrealistic kind of way. I mean it more in terms of making the lived experience within dreams a first-class citizen alongside your waking experience. Just taking that step seriously really opens up your perspective, because if you have to take dreams as real experience and not something that's demoted to a kind of second-class status, then that really starts, I think, playing on your whole relationship to reality. And it's you know, it's open to everybody, I think, in some ways. And the second one would be, and I don't know if people have come across this, but Eugene Gendlin's focusing practice, where it's very, very simple practice, but it's going into the felt sense. And really, it just takes the form of asking, you locate it as a sensation in the body, something that's kind of trying to tell you that there's some unresolved issue in the subconscious or in kind of below conscious realms. And you just literally ask it, what is going on? What's the problem? What's this all about? And if you just give it space, more often than not, it comes up with an answer. And that answer often takes a poetic or imagistic or you know, but it's a very fascinating way. It's a very accessible way into that direct perception, into sort of into video, you know, into seeing. And I think that's also maybe not that well known, but potentially very, very useful, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I mean, both of those great examples. The idea of seriously journaling your dream states, I think that's a great practice, because we're conditioned, because we primarily identify with the gross realm, we primarily identify with the waking realm. We have that largely unexamined belief that what's real is what you see when you're awake. And when you're asleep and dreaming, that's kind of unreal. That's just your brain imagining stuff. But there have been cultures in the past, rare cultures in the past, that have actually believed the opposite, that your waking state is actually the thing that's imaginary. And when you sleep and you're dreaming, that's actually what's real. So the way you described it there would be a way to challenge that presumption that the waking state is what is really real, but to think of these as two equally valid realities that are playing out simultaneously. And that can obviously loosen up your rigid sense of identification with the waking gross state. The second point as well, in tantric practice, I've worked with tantric teachers where the primary practice is to deeply feel into the body and to locate where it is in the body that you're creating your fundamental self-contraction. Where in your body is that tension or that deepest recoil from reality that is the physical substrate for your conceptual sense of separate self. Because the ego, although we've talked of it as a narrative being created in the left brain, it also has a deep physical correlate. And some of the tantric practices are about locating that correlate. Typically, it could be in the chest area. That's a very common place people find that sense of self. And then to engage in yogic practices or in devotion to the guru to release that sense of that tension in the body. And then we observe that there's a correlate release of the ego narrative in the brain. So these are other ways that we can open ourselves up to state development. So yeah, thank you, Steve.
Thank you so much, Nish. I think you did a great job of kind of encapsulating both waking up and growing up. And there are so many different pathways both of those phases can happen. So this definitely gives a lot of clarity, and especially if someone is in the beginning stages of exploring these topics, it's super helpful to have this. Thank you everyone for joining in. If there is anything else you would like to share, you're welcome to make comments.
This has been a wonderful conversation. I've really appreciated it. Thank you, Suma, for providing the forum, and Nish for providing the structure for the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Cindy,
Mm-hmm.
and for all your great comments, and to all of you for all your great comments and questions. It's been really great. Thank you.
And I would also love to thank the listeners, to everyone for making this happen.